Hello, I'm Ehsan Haque, and in this presentation, I'll talk about our paper, The Nuanced Nature of Trust and Privacy Control Adoption in the Context of Google. The rise of online marketing and shopping leads companies to incorporate an ad revenue-based business model that depends on collecting and monetizing user data. For example, in 2022, Google's reported revenue was 279.8 billion US dollars, about 80% of which came from advertising revenue of 224.4 billion US dollars. Aggressive data collection growth as an industry standard practice has raised severe concerns about user data privacy. To tackle these privacy concerns, regulations such as GDPR and CCPA recommend that service providers offer privacy controls to give end users control over their data. However, prior works show that choice architecture can be cleverly manipulated to primarily benefit data collection while helping build trust towards the service provider. When it comes to the actual adoption of privacy controls, limited works examined privacy control adoption and how it is associated with the trust dynamics between the service providers and end users. Prior works mainly looked at privacy control adoption in social networking site contexts, where offered privacy controls are the disclosure settings that enable users to limit sharing from a recipient pool. In contrast, in this study, we investigated privacy control adoption and the interplay of trust based on privacy controls' underlying purpose of sharing and usage. I will elaborate on the distinction between these two control categories in the following slides. In addition, our work also incorporates variables such as control adoption behavior and technical literacy to examine how these factors affect users' trust perceptions. The first independent variable that we considered was the type of privacy controls. For that, we used Brandymart's conceptualization of categorizing privacy controls based on their underlying purposes. Based on the purpose, a privacy control can be categorized as a sharing or a usage control. Sharing controls offer control over sharing of data. An example would be a disclosure setting in the social networking sites that offer controls over restricting the sharing of data to a recipient pool. However, important to note that such sharing restriction does not affect the service provider's data collection or usage. In contrast, a usage control allows users to restrict the usage of data already collected. For example, we can consider ad personalization settings in the Google account platform. Using Google Search and other Google services allows data collection. However, turning off ad personalization restricts Google from using the collected data to provide personalized ads. Naively, usage controls offer more control over collected data in terms of restricting how service providers can use them. In this study, we also considered variables such as privacy control adoption behavior and technical literacy based on prior findings that show these factors impact users' privacy attitudes and behaviors. To measure participants' technical literacy, we used Kang et al.'s technical knowledge of privacy tool scale, which uses a scoring scheme to determine participants' technical literacy to avoid self-reporting. To measure participants' adoption behavior, we undertook behavioral measurements of the current settings of the privacy controls. We defined an adopter as someone who changed the default options of a particular privacy control. These variables lead us to the research questions we investigated in the study. Research question 1 asks whether adopting sharing versus usage controls differs based on users' technical literacy. Research question 2 asks whether trust towards the service provider differs between technical and non-technical users. Research question 3 concerns whether adopters and non-adopters in different literacy levels differ in trust perception across the sharing versus usage control categories. In research question 4, we ask what are the reasons that may enhance or dampen users' trust towards a service provider's user privacy protection. To investigate the research questions, we chose Google as the study context. We chose four privacy controls from Google platforms, 2 from each category. Browser history and cookies were chosen as sharing controls, and location history and ad personalization were chosen as usage controls. Please refer to the paper where we explain why these controls fall under these categories, alongside providing our rationale for choosing Google. Participants reported their current settings for 3 of the 4 controls except for the browser history control. Participants reported their frequency of using the feature for the browsing history control, as there is no settings to enable or disable. The survey was performed on Amazon Mechanical Turk platform. Eligible participants were randomly assigned to the sharing or the usage control groups. The survey took 20 minutes on average, and participants were compensated $3. The study was approved by the University of Connecticut IRB. In total, we collected 209 responses across both groups. The groups were found to be demographically similar in terms of age, gender, and technical literacy levels. Please refer to the paper for a detailed review of the participants' demographics. Our study had some limitations. For example, we took the samples from the Amazon Mechanical Turk platform, which may not be a representative population of the United States. In addition, we only investigated 4 privacy controls from Google platforms. As a result, other privacy controls from Google or another service provider may be perceived and adapted differently. Further, we defined adoption behavior based on behavioral measurements of current settings of the privacy controls. However, keeping the defaults may not always indicate non-adoption. Now I'll talk about some of the key findings. Due to time constraints, I can only touch on some of the findings. Hence, I invite interested readers to refer to the paper for a complete picture of our results and takeaways. Regarding the adoption rate of the privacy controls, most participants reported keeping the default settings. For example, 53% of participants did not change the default for the cookies control, and about 70% of the participants kept the default of the ad personalization control. Regarding trust perceptions towards Google, both technical and non-technical participants agreed on high competence of Google. However, technical participants significantly rated lower integrity and benevolence perceptions of Google compared to the non-technical participants. We observed an interesting interaction when looking at differences between adopters and non-adopters in their trust perceptions. Technical adopters and technical non-adopters did not differ in their trust perception of Google for both sharing and usage controls. However, interestingly, non-technical adopters of the sharing controls reported higher trust towards Google, whereas non-technical adopters of the usage control reported lower trust towards Google. These findings indicate that lower trust in Google may be a driving factor for adopting usage controls among the non-technical participants. From qualitative analysis, we identified positive and negative factors affecting trust towards Google's privacy protection. Rational profit motive and good track record affected trust positively for technical users. On the other hand, top-notch security, quality, and convenience of service mattered most for non-technical participants. Participants mentioned the availability of privacy options as a positive factor affecting trust. In contrast, Google's data collection and usage practice alongside lack of transparency was mentioned most as reasons to affect trust negatively. Several shortcomings of the current privacy options are identified. For example, participants mentioned that the data collection is turned on by default and users must opt out. In addition, Google's data-centric profit motive was perceived to contradict privacy controls' purpose of restricting data collection, hence questioning the control's efficacy. In this paper, we discussed the implications of our finding, including the need for combined effort to balance the power dynamics between the service providers and end users. We also explained how trust calibrating strategies can be helpful in proactive privacy adoption, especially among the non-technical user group. I invite all to read our paper. Thank you for watching. I would be happy to answer any questions that anyone may have.